Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, the author of numerous novels and book-length nonfiction.
I'm Molly Jo Riley. I am producer of the podcast and author of the upcoming location mystery novel, NOLA.
And we do welcome you all here. Sorry we are a few minutes late getting started. Hopefully you were able to find us on YouTube Live. Hopefully you are viewing live. We're still trying to work out the kinks and find the most efficient way of getting you the word out when we are recording, which we do every Tuesday night at 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Would love to have you along for the ride so that you could ask some questions as we go and participate in the discussion. It's always lots of fun. Though I have noticed since we've switched over to YouTube Live, our participation has dropped a little bit, and I think that's because people are having trouble finding us. I think it's because you can't find us through Google Plus anymore. It's a little more challenging to really have to figure that out. We are in talks of how to fix that. We've been talking about it for the last few weeks, still brainstorming ideas on the most efficient way to bring you our broadcast so that you don't have to dig through all the different so you don't have to dig through the entire internet to find us, which can be very time consuming. The internet is rather large. I don't know if you've discovered that. It's a bit of a rabbit hole. So we're going to try and bring that to the surface for you. And if you are watching us on YouTube, either live or later, we do ask that you give us a thumbs up icon. Helps us out quite a bit. We are rapidly approaching the magical 100 subscribers number, so please subscribe to us. Tell your friends. Tell them to subscribe to us. They don't even have to watch our videos. All they have to do is click subscribe. That makes us happy. So thank you all for...
It makes us happier if you watch, but happy as a base level if you just subscribe.
Thank you for the clarification. I figure I probably should have mentioned that. And I do have a new router and some high-speed internet, so our hope is that tonight's broadcast will be a little more stable. So that's our hope here. Let's jump into our Ask the Author question, which comes all the way from Eileen Dover, author of that fantastic book, Tragedy on the Cliffs by Eileen Dover. Are familiar with it. Actually, it comes from Jacqueline Patterson, who is a regular listener of the show and a friend of ours. And she told me that she had, hundreds of questions to ask. And I said, that sounds great. Just make up, fake names so that it doesn't sound like they're all coming from the same person. And so, hence Eileen Dover. And she wants to know, what is the best way to include description without overwhelming or alienating the reader? And this came in kind of late. It actually came in today, so it's a bit of a late ad. Pops has not had a chance to respond to this, so we're actually going to just have, I'm going to mention something, Molly's going to mention something, but Jacqueline and anyone else listening, if you're interested, dig through our archives a little bit at aarongansky.com. You should find one on detail, I believe, and setting in detail. And we cover this question, I don't want to say in great length, but probably in a lot more detail than we're going to cover it now. We use more detail answering questions about detail earlier. That's too many details. Okay, moving on. Now, it is a really great question, and I think it's something that a lot of writers really struggle with. And I'm going to say the answer just isn't very easy. I think there's a lot of subjectivity here. For example, F. Scott Fitzgerald has all sorts of description, and then you look at someone like Hemingway, more of a minimalist, who is very sparse with his description. And so Fitzgerald uses it in almost a symbolic way. Hemingway uses it more as, I guess he can get a little bit symbolic with it too, but he only pays attention to some really important details, whereas Fitzgerald is going to take more time to really set the scene. I tend to fall more in the F. Scott Fitzgerald camp. I like a lot of description and sensory detail. I like to put in as much as I can to really help the reader feel like they're experiencing a novel rather than just reading a novel. But I've got other friends who are a lot more minimalistic in their approach. And when I write flash fiction, I'm a lot more minimalistic in my approach as well. And I really kind of come back to what Brett Anthony Johnston said about this, which is, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but something to the effect of, you want to give the reader the raw materials from which they can build their own library, rather than giving them a linguistic blueprint of that library. So you don't need to sit there and tell us the exact dimensions of the room and how high the ceiling is and what the paint on the wall is, etc. General rule of thumb, if it's going to play a part in the story, you have to describe it. Otherwise, just enough to set the mood and the scene and the tone of the piece. Usually what I do is I overwrite on the first and second drafts, usually on the second draft. And then on the third draft, I'll go back and I'll cut things out. And I'm really looking for, instead of 7 or 8 kind of lazy descriptions, I'm looking for the 1 or 2 that really pop, that are very original, that are going to establish the mood that I want them to establish. A lot of times that's figurative language. And that's usually what I'm looking for. Molly, what about you?
I write in first person, so I include whatever my character would notice or sense, feel, or think consciously. Like, she wouldn't normally think, oh, I breathe in, I breathe out, so I'm not going to add that. But when she's new to New Orleans and the humidity, that's foreign to her, so she notices that. So for that, I notice, I write in her character, she'll say, my skin felt clammy, it was a little harder to breathe than what I'm used to, that sort of thing. The trick for me is to bring my reader into the story and not preach it to them. And since people react different ways, I want them to translate and interpret the story unless they absolutely have to know certain things, such as furniture placement, for an example. Unless somebody's going to stub their toe, it doesn't matter to me if the desk is on the left or the right side of the room. I just give the general information and let the reader create it in their own mind with all the minute details.
Excellent. Pops, just off the cuff, did we miss anything? Anything that you want to add to that?
Well, my first question was, are we talking about scenic description, or are we talking about individual description, character description? So I wasn't sure which way to go with that. I think a lot of it would depend, as Molly said, is you talk about what is going to play a role in it, but you do want to set a background. You always have to have a backdrop for a stage play. It's the same thing in writing, but you can't over detail. So unless it's something crucial, or if you're using environment as a character, you're on a fishing boat in a storm, then you're probably going to do more description about the ocean and the like, as Hemingway did with The Old Man and the Sea. So that if you're using a scene, and I mean a scenic, when I say that, as a character, then you probably want to give more detail. But if you're going on and on, you have several paragraphs of narration, no dialogue or any real action taking place in front of that backdrop, then you're probably giving too much too fast. So spread it out a little bit.
All right. Well said. Thank you very much. That may have been the shortest Ask the Author question we've had in quite some time. We
do tend to ramble on those a little bit, huh?
Yeah, we do. Give us too much time to answer a question, and we'll take too much time to answer a question. So today, just rolling up our sleeves and getting right into it. So let's talk about dialogue, keeping it 100. And if you're not familiar with the term keeping it 100, it's quasi-current slang used by a middle-aged man, which most people might be embarrassed by that, but you know what? That's fine. I'm okay with it. I don't get embarrassed easily. So keeping it real.
I still call people dude, so.
Yeah. I had somebody tell me that. Keeping it 100. I was like, 100 what? I don't understand. So 100%. Keeping it real and authentic. So that's what it is. So we're looking at dialogue this whole month. So this week we're looking at making real dialogue or authentic dialogue. Next week we're going to take a look at things that kill dialogue, which I don't know. There's a lot of them. And the following week, we're going to look at how to beat attribute tags, because that's one of the toughest things to do, is to tag your dialogue in such a way that you're going to keep people properly oriented, but also not repetitive and not over the top. So there's some general rules and guidelines to follow there that I think have worked well, served us well over the years, and we're going to share some of those secrets with you in a couple more weeks. After that, we'll have our wild card. But for this week, we need to jump in and kind of define perhaps a little bit of what dialogue is, what it means, and even how to spell it. Pops, you want to handle this one?
Now, a couple of things from Al's Know Your Terms Emporium. And dialogue is one of those things that you'll see spelled two different ways. And there's usually a preferred spelling, and then there's one that's also acceptable. And I hit on that when I noticed, Aaron, you were using the secondary use, and I was using the primary use, and I thought, well, maybe we got to mention that to people. Dialogue is spelled D-I-A-L-O-G-U-E. Now, some people drop the U-E at the end, and that is acceptable in some dictionaries and in some style sheets. However, when you go to the dictionary, you'll see that they will show both spellings, and when you find that with the word, understand that the preferred spelling is the first one given. The alternate spelling is the second one given. So dialogue with the UE at the end is the preferred way of spelling dialogue, but a lot of people cut the UE. Same thing with epilogue. So sometimes those, because it comes from another language, it comes from the Greek into the French into the English, and along the way that UE got put on, and then it's been dropped since. And while we're talking about the Greek, just so everyone knows what the word means, it's really a compound word. It's got a preposition, dia, D-I-A, we would say in English, and then logos, which means word. So dia means through or between. You know what a diameter is? It means to measure across. So it's distance across a circle through the middle of it. So there's any number of words that use dia, meaning through or between. And then logos means speech or word. There's really variations of it in Greek, but it means to converse with. So simply dialogue is to exchange words across the space between people, and it just comes to mean conversation, people talking to people, which is more than you want to need. You need to know, but you could be on Jeopardy someday. So
I think we should all go on Jeopardy as a team. I have a question. You say dialogue with the UE is preferred spelling, but some dictionaries give it a... Who determines, how is it determined that that is the preferred spelling? Is that because it's the one that's been most common, or is it because it's a little more formal? How is that? Yeah. Why is that preferred? Cat over kitty?
Language changes over time, and it's always being rewritten, and we put up with it all the time. For example, if you look at Associated Press style sheet and you look up email, it'll spell it without the hyphen, which I think is just an atrocity. But if you look at what book writers use, the Chicago Manual of Style, it still insists on having the hyphen. Otherwise, it becomes Emil instead of email. Well, it doesn't matter. Over time, these things begin to change. And when you have words that come from other languages, and many of our English words that we use come from Greek or Latin through French into English, they get changed over time. And then it's based on usage. So another example of it, since you brought it up, is how do you write all right? He did all right. Mm-hmm. Okay. The one you're seeing more and more now is a single word, A-L-R-I-G-H-T, which is the non-preferred. It's still, for regular writing and formal writing, it's two words, A-L-L, all, and then write R-I-G-H-T. And that's the preferred. So when I'm writing a book and I have to use the phrase all right, I use it as two words. If I'm shooting out an email, I don't care if it's all right, or all wrong. Use whichever you want. So the preferred spellings come into dictionaries based on the usage that's most often used by people, and since that changes over time, the dictionaries begin to change over time. So, but right now, dialogue with the UE at the end is still the preferred, and I believe you'll find that in the Webster's and American Dictionary and Oxford English, the American Oxford English version. So, did that help?
Very much, thank you.
Yeah, you probably got a nap in the middle of that, didn't you?
I took a couple sips of water.
You know, I've always used the UE until recently, and I
Well, you're
think
just wrong.
I know.
You
I
are all
think
wrong.
I think I had done some research and thought that concluded that the UE was more of the British type spelling, in the same way that they add a U to color. But now the way you're describing it, Pops, is it's kind of like the OUGH on through, which now drive through is just THRU, probably because they didn't want to make longer signs. But it's
Well, of
almost
course not, because then
unacceptable.
it would be slow food, not fast food.
There you go. So I think that there's a little bit, like you say, a shift in the language. Either I think is acceptable. One of the big things that you want to look for is consistency. Obviously, what your publisher is using. Please pay no attention to the show notes where I use them interchangeably. I should probably do
Hey,
a
you did,
search and
huh?
find. I'm going to make Molly do a search and find for dialogue and make sure they're all spelled the same way so that I look better. And
Oh,
then
it's
I'm,
always good
Okay.
to have something to offend somebody, you know.
yeah.
Always have something to offend everybody with that. You know, I came across an interesting thing. It came from Steve Lobby. He was one time my agent, and he's my friend. And Writer's Digest put out one of those drawings, those info charts, and I was going to put it in the show notes, and I may have to look that up and try to get that done. But interesting stuff. But what you were talking about, Aaron, applies to what's on that chart. They charted some of the usages, first of all, for what makes a best-selling novel, but how things have changed. So if you go back to, you know, like Jane Austen or something, even Mark Twain, some of the older writers, lots more semicolons. Closer you get to our time, the fewer the semicolons. Question marks, rarely used back in those days like Mark Twain, on the rise here. And it's interesting to see how those things change.
Indeed, it is. That sounds like a great wild card, Pops. So I
That
think
could
you
be,
should
yeah.
track that down, and maybe we could take a look at that. That could be a lot of fun. Trends in language sounds like a good one.
That
So
sounds a lot of fun. And just for the record, there were 10, Aaron, 10 dialogues without the UEs. But I wouldn't call you out in public on that or anything. This is just a side note.
you know what it is I took a lot of my older notes before I started switching to the without the UE, and then kind of copied and pasted, and then just didn't bother to look back through them because this is going to be shocking, but I have other things to do with my time. And so, you know, my family was complaining, like, we never see you, Daddy, and we don't remember what your face looks like. And so, you know, I had to feed them. They get so very hungry if you don't feed them for a few days. So
I've heard that.
yeah, just so demanding, so demanding. Anyhow, so there are different types of dialogue, and not a lot of people realize this, or they don't know the terms that go along with it. They see them, they understand what's going on, but they don't necessarily have the terms to go along with it. So there are some terms that we're going to use here just real quick to kind of show you what you can do with dialogue. The first is summary dialogue, and this is where you simply summarize what somebody said. So you're not going to use quotation marks here because it's not exactly what came out of their mouth. For example, you might say something like, Yvonne told him that she wanted a divorce. Bum, bum, bum. Now, indirect dialogue is going to be a little bit more specific than summary dialogue. It's kind of the between summary and direct dialogue. And this is going to be a lot more specific. It's going to better portray the feeling of what was said. But again, it's still summarizing. It's not word for word. Therefore, we're not using the quotation marks. You might get something like, Yvonne said that she wanted a divorce, that he was selfish, that he'd always been selfish, that he'd never given her a thought about what she really wanted. And that would be indirect dialogue. Now, direct dialogue is what we typically think of when we say dialogue. This is exactly what comes out of a character's mouth. So we'd have something like, Yvonne said, comma quotes, I'm done with you. Paint the house any stupid color you want, end quotes. Some writers like to get fancy, and they like to mix it up a little bit. So this might be an intermixed dialogue, where you get some of this, some of that. You might have something like, Yvonne listed his faults, too selfish, too domineering, too petty, period, quotes. And cheap too, cheapest person I've ever met, end quotes. She unfolded some yellow paper and read out loud what the lawyer had told her about equitable property division. I should cite this because I don't have it in the show notes, and so I'm going to put it in here right now. These examples come from Jerome Stern's Making Shapely Fiction. I believe that's where I got those. So really good idea there. Pops, you've also added internal dialogue, which we're seeing more of. And this is where we just have a character carrying on a mental conversation. I'm going to put you on the spot. Pops, do you want to give him an example of this?
Yeah, really what it is, it's recording internal dialogue where we talk to ourselves quite a bit. You know, so we do something stupid, we might call ourselves stupid. In a novel, what you do is you don't use quotes. If you do use quotes, then you'd have to say something like, she thought. Please don't ever say, she thought to herself. Who else would she think to? So it's just she thought. But since that is a form of dialogue tag, it's better just to get away with it. And the trend now, and the more accepted practice now, is that you put that in italics. And we know that we're now inside the character's head. This, of course, applies to third person, not first person. But it applies to third person where you give that thought. So so you might have somebody say, we've got to get out of here, we've got to get out of here now. And then the internal dialogue would be, if we can only find a way. So she didn't want to say it out loud for some reason. Like that. So internal dialogue, very important. Don't want to do a ton of it in your books because it gets distracting, the change in the font and stuff. You know, if you have somebody praying, that's usually done in italics as if they're praying silently, as internal dialogue.
Define a lot for internal dialogue. What is your definition of distracting?
Well, if you look at your book,
my book, yeah, that's okay. I have to go now.
I joke, I kid. No, you know, when I write, I set up my word processor so that the page looks like a printed page. I don't go to standard manuscript format till I'm at the end. I do that because I get more lines on the screen at one time, but it also helps me see what the page looks like. And if there's a whole bunch of stuff in italics, then I want to reconsider that. Usually it's more spice than it is meat. So you don't serve up a plate of spice to someone for a meal, but you might spice what you serve them up. That's really what internal dialogue and use of italics for other reasons is.
And I say a handful of pepper, and I really have to think my whole way now.
All right, we lost you there, Molly. So all of those good words are just gone.
I was worried it was me. I was worried it was just me.
No, you're stellar so far.
Hooray. So there are some bright spots here. But yeah, with internal dialogue, Pops, you did make a point that people don't think to other people unless, of course, they are telepathic, in which case they do. And that was an issue I ran into in a book that I recently completed where I had a telepath who did have conversations with other people, and she did think to other people. So that was a whole other issue. But writing about real people, they don't think to other people. They just, think inside their mind. So thank you for that, Pops. To kind of answer your question, Molly Jo, I really think that this is, from what I've studied, perhaps a divide along the gender line. Because I read The Hunger Games, and I said I liked it, except there was way too much internal dialogue. I got really, I don't want to say irritated, I got really bored with it. And most of the guys I know say, oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. Most of the girls I know, no, that's exactly right. That was just the right amount. And so I do wonder if you've got a female character that's doing a lot of internal monologue or dialogue, that might be one thing. If you've got a guy doing it, at some point, guys are pretty easy to figure out. They want to eat, they want to sleep. That's pretty much it. So not a lot more to it than that. Maybe to play some video games from time to time, but anyhow, we're moving on here. For the purposes of our conversation tonight and for the coming weeks, we're going to be looking specifically at direct dialogue. That is what's coming inside of the quotation marks, because that, I feel, is that carries the most weight with it. You're either going to do it well or you're going to do it poorly. People who say they do dialogue well, they're referring to what they put inside the quotation marks. Those who do it poorly struggle with these, what to put inside of the quotation marks. So we're going to have some guidelines here for you to follow that have served us well, some tips and tricks, etc. But before we kind of get there, I do want to make a few points about dialogue. And the first is this, that dialogue should be an intensification or an expansion of the conflict, or even the tension, if we want to say that. A lot of people will say that dialogue is a break in the action. I'll talk about this later, but it really isn't. Dialogue should be adding to the conflict, intensifying it in some way, or presenting a new one. Rob Roberge, a mentor of mine that I had at Antioch University, used to say the dialogue is people saying no to each other in interesting ways. And I'm not sure if he pulled that from somebody and I've forgotten who he referenced or not, but I've always loved that. Dialogue is people saying no to each other in interesting ways. Why? Because when somebody tells you no, that's conflict. Can I have ice cream? My son asks. No, I tell him. Guess what? We've got conflict in my house. And so that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. He continues to say, Rob Roberge does, about dialogue, that it's about people talking, but it can also be about people not communicating. And some of the really best dialogue is where you have two people talking at cross purposes. They're not communicating efficiently. The master of this, of course, was Hemingway. Hills Like White Elephants. And so if you want a good study in dialogue, find that story. I'm sure you can find it online. Read it. The man is talking about one thing. The woman is talking about something completely different. It's the same basic issue at heart, but their viewpoints are so radically different, and they are not, very clearly, not communicating. And that creates the tension. All of the tension, all of the conflict in that story comes within the quotation marks. There's really little else, little other conflict and tension going through there. It's all within the quotation marks. And so Hemingway does a really good job of this. Now, when you have a lack of communication between characters, obviously it's creating conflict, it's creating tension. Obviously, if you have an argument, that's conflict. When you have a character quietly acquiesce a point, that can be conflict as well. So if they're agreeing to something but they don't really want to agree to it, there's some conflict there. There's some tension within the character. And not all dialogue in a novel will be conflict driven. And I do want to make this point because I don't want to go so far that you think that dialogue is only for conflict and tension. It should be mainly about that. But don't forget, there's room for some comic relief, the occasional quip, an appropriate turn of phrase, etc. In the Hand of Adonai series, when I've got a really heavy conversation going on, I can always rely on Erica to come up with some ridiculously sarcastic comment that kind of breaks some of the tension that's building a little bit, and it gives the reader a moment to kind of laugh before I kind of turn it back up. And so just remember, don't overdo it with the comedy unless you're writing a comedy. But there is an appropriate time to have dialogue serve a purpose other than just conflict and tension. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It does.
Okay, excellent. Plowing on. John DeFresney, pardon me, says that dialogue is not a break in the action, it's an intensification of the action. And then this is really the heart of our cast tonight. He says, here's something else dialogue is not. It is not the way we speak. Dialogue must appear realistic without being realistic. It is not natural, but it must suggest naturalness. And so you'll see in fiction that there's a lot of these kind of conflicts, that kind of these almost ironies, if you will. How can dialogue be, real without being real? How can it be natural but not be natural? And I like the second part of that where he says it must suggest naturalness, right? Dialogue must not be natural but must feel natural. Must be real, must not be real but must feel real. And for us, what that means is that we need to tune our ears to listen for dialogue the way it is, and then the way that it should be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, especially if we will remember that dialogue is there for a reason. It is a way of defining characters. It's a way of defining the situation, the danger, the pluses, the minuses. Most of that's going to come through dialogue. We're all attuned to dialogue to do. We as the writers have to do is we have to translate from what the ear hears and just in general life into something that will transfer to the page that will not be confusing. And sometimes that's difficult to do, especially if you're trying to do dialect, which can be very difficult and misleading and confusing when you're trying to do, say, maybe, if you're doing something around the Civil War, you're going to have African Americans who've grown up in slavery and their language is a little different. If you go, to certain parts of Chicago, the language is different. Same thing with New York and California beaches. Well, some of that's just foreign languages to many people unless you grow up in it. So you always have to keep the reader in mind, and it is best to hint at. Let's say you're doing an Irish accent. I had to do this in a book, and I would just drop a few things Irish would say. I dropped the G for this particular character off the ends of ing endings, that sort of thing. But I didn't go heavy into trying to create every nuance of the brogue that the person would have. That would be too confusing, too taxing on the reader, and would distract from the story. So all I need to do is tell them they're Irish, spoke with a heavy accent, times, find something the person is going to say over and over again and be consistent in that. But that's it. So I think the guy you're quoting here is absolutely right. It really hints at it. The reader will always bring something to the book. They want to construct something. So if you over detail a physical description, they don't get to contribute. If you over detail a scenic, they don't get to contribute. Same thing with the language. If you tell them enough about what it is, it's a French accent, they will fill in their mind. Spell everything out like that.
The advice that I got about dialect when I was at Antioch was don't use it. And the reasoning for that was that if you don't do it properly and you don't do it precisely, that it can often come across as racist, or at least somewhat your character comes up sounding like a stereotype rather than an actual character. I found the best ways to accomplish it. And of course, every time I say that, somebody goes, "What about Mark Twain?" I am not Mark Twain. And I embrace that. He did what I can't do. Hooray for Mark Twain. I'm also not Cormac McCarthy. I get that. I'm not E. E. Cummings. My poetry professor told me that several times. And so it's been beaten into my head. I get that. But the problems with dialect can be that it can come across as demeaning. Pops, I like the way you handled it, where you just had one or two rules that you followed. Really, you drop in the vocabulary, and I think we might talk about this a little bit later. If you're talking about somebody from Minnesota, that they might be drinking a pop instead of a soda.
It definitely would be.
Right?
That's not a maybe. I mean, that's a definite. If you're from Minnesota, you drink pop or soda pop.
Yeah, soda pop.
Sure you do.
Yeah, and you don't spell sure S-H-U-R-E. Sure. That would be. It can come across demeaning. So avoiding that, but making a couple of adjustments to remind the reader that this person is speaking in a heavy Irish accent. I think that's totally appropriate, and a genius move. It's a good, smart move, and that way, as you say, Pops, the brain's going to be able to hear the words that are on the page that they're interpreting through their eyes, right? The eyes read the words, and then the ears, it translates into the auditory for us. And so, Pops, you were even going to make another point here about King's Dreamcatcher.
Yeah, I'm not big on bad language, as you might imagine with my background and the like. But I was reading Dreamcatcher, King's Dreamcatcher, and of course it's just chock full of rough language, kind of stuff you'd hear down on people loading ships and unloading ships and stuff like that, kind of stuff that makes sailors blush, that sort of thing. But I was probably a third of the way through the book when I realized that what Stephen King had done is he taught me more about his characters by the language they used in the dialogue than he did by telling me about them. So that's one of those things where he didn't just come out and say, now this guy's got a PhD and he's very sharp and he's smarter than all the rest of his buddies, and one who didn't even make it through high school. Instead, he does it by the way they talk. So that part of the dialogue is defining the character. And then even the way they swore or the way they cursed. And then I realized I knew more about those characters because he did it through the dialogue. He demonstrated rather than described. He demonstrated what his characters were like, and that's when I realized just how good he was at that kind of thing. It was quite a lesson for me.
I think Radiolab did a great podcast on language, specifically what we might call vulgar language or inappropriate language, etc. And some of the results were interesting, that in high stress, high tension situations, people rarely will use inappropriate language. Very rarely, even if they have, even sailors, etc. But for whatever reason, when the temperature is turned up, the language goes down, which seems counterintuitive. But it's something to keep in mind. If you're on a submarine full of sailors and there's a torpedo coming at you, there's probably not a whole lot of foul language going on. There's just going to be, let's do this, let's do that. There's going to be a lot more order to the language. Whereas when you're just traveling through the sea underwater, you get a little tense. You might say something inappropriate to a friend or whatever the case may be. So that's something else to consider. Is how that's used.
That reminds me, there was a movie that came out some time ago about a submarine, and as most of the people know, I wrote a book called A Ship Possessed, which is really a submarine. You should call it a boat, but marketing, Possessed. And someone thought this movie had stolen the core idea from my book, so I watched it to see if they had stolen it. They had. It was a very different story than from mine. But in this World War II submarine, they rescue, I think it's 3 people off a raft. One of them is a woman. And as the woman walks through the submarine, the way the different sailors talked about her showed their education level. In a submarine, the education is roughly divided. You have officer country, those are the people with the college degrees, and that's at the front of the boat. At the back of the boat, you have the people who have less education, maybe not even been through high school, working back in the stink and the diesel fumes and stuff like that. And the way they referred to the woman through each section of the submarine was absolutely brilliant. And defined those characters by the kind of language they used to describe this woman. So she goes from being a dame to things I don't even want to mention here in reference to her.
On that point, it reminds me of a great story in The Things That Carried by Tim O'Brien. And what made me think of it is that there's a word that one of the soldiers uses to describe this particular woman. And O'Brien goes into great detail about why he selected that particular word and that he had not chosen these other words. And of course it's an inappropriate word because it's in the middle of war. And it's a very tragic thing. And you read the story and it's just, it's crushing and it's heartbreaking. And it lends credibility to why that particular word was chosen. Again, I'm not going to necessarily sit here and advocate that you use inappropriate language in your fiction or your novel, but if that's a thing that you're doing, just be cautious and aware of how it's being used. And again, I think the point that we're trying to make is characters are different, right? Not everybody curses the same way. Not
Sure.
Everybody speaks the same way. And they'll change their dialogue based on who they're having a conversation with. I speak differently to my wife than I do to, my boss or my colleague or my children. Not much different, but there are some differences there. And we speak to our friends one way, but we speak to our bosses a different way. Unless you're lucky enough to have a friend who is a boss and a boss who is a friend. But whatever the case may be, it's something to consider. And I think that's what good writers do, is they listen intently to different people to hear how their dialogue varies. So we might have the character who never shuts up. We might have the character who rarely speaks. We might have the character who's constantly mixing up their idioms, in Short Circuit. You guys remember number 5 is alive, and there was a character there who kept trying to get all the idioms right, and he kept mixing them up. Or Biff from Back to the Future. Why don't you make like a tree and get out of here? And just kind of the nonsensical stuff there. Is your character from Brooklyn, or are they from Austin, Texas? Are they from England, or, as you said, Pops, earlier, Ireland? What do their voices sound like? What do their idioms sound like? How do their vocabularies vary and differ? And I think there's some great resources online where you can find those types of things to look up, and a little bit of research will help you out. So how do you do all this? Well, there are a few things that you really want to think of when you're creating a voice for each of your characters. And each of your characters should have a voice. And it should be different than the narrator. The narrator should not sound like your characters. Your characters should not sound like your narrator, unless you're writing in first person. And so the first thing that you want to consider is their age. Are they older? Are they younger? Are they saying, stupid slang like you got to keep it 100? Are they saying
23 skidoo?
Yeah, 23 skidoo. It's the cat's pajamas, or the cat's meow, and all those types of things. Their vocabulary and their language is going to change based on that. It might also have a little bit to do with their education and life experience, which you talked about a little bit in the King novel, Pops. But age is going to have a pretty profound impact on how people speak. You also want to consider gender. Okay, this may not change their vocabulary in the same sense that a man and a woman in Minnesota are still going to call a soda a pop. They're both still going to be wrong, but that's what they're going to call it.
Wow, thanks.
Sorry,
Thanks.
Send all your letters to Aaron.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, good times. Especially, but if they're speaking to someone of the same gender or the opposite gender, that sometimes will change. And we can tell a lot about a character. A male character, by the way, he speaks to women. We can tell a lot about a female character by the way they speak to men. Also, vice versa. The gender relationships can play a major part in developing your characters. And so you want to kind of consider that as well. Pops, you were going to say something about your books for Zondervan.
Yeah, I did a series for Zondervan, a Harper Row company. Imprint, and there was a lot of guy stuff in it because it's an architectural engineer who travels the globe, and he has a team, and they're always getting in some kind of adventure and some kind of danger. And the way they talk to each other is different than when someone else is around. So if there are women around, the way they talk is a little different than when it's just the guys. The humor they use is different. The way they express fear is different. So I always included that in the dialogue, that kind of dynamic. And there's been several where I've had to do that. When I was doing the books with Strucker, I'm dealing with a team of Army Special Ops people, and the way they talk to each other is very different than the way just men in general talk and the way they joke around. So the dialogue will define the characters and the situation, and group dynamics too. That's the other thing we should probably throw in here, is that your dialogue will define the group dynamics.
Well said, exactly. Other things to consider, their origin. They come from the Deep South, the Midwest, India, China. Consider the differences, as I've said several times, soda and pop. See this, I got way ahead of my show notes. That's where it pops up naturally in the show notes, and I just jumped the gun with that. So, but some of the regional differences are important. Also, their upbringing, religious upbringing, can, even if it's not religious, just in their work. Every occupation, I'll jump down here to occupation. Every occupation is going to change vocabularies, the expectation of the knowledge of the vocabulary, etc. If they come from a religious background, they might say things like "bought by the blood of the Lamb," whereas most people who do not come from a church background have no clue what that is. Or what that means, and it sounds weird. And when they hear the term being born again, they might think of reincarnation. And so these terms have a lot to do with building the background. The occupation, I am a teacher, and so I have to know all of the acronyms. As a matter of fact, I'm actually going to start an educational group called ANNA, which stands for Absolutely No Acronyms. It's my own little ironic protest there.
We need a
there we go.
Rim shot here.
Yeah, but if you work in education, you know everything is acronyms. Everything is acronyms, and perhaps to the same extent, you know, the medical profession,
military,
lawyers, military, right? Everything's acronyms.
Especially lawyers, the Navy,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
And lawyers might say things like, "I'm afraid our agreement constituted a quid pro quo, and therefore I do not owe you the money you insist upon." So they're going to start throwing around legal language, and really you can even get this as something like a diner. I remember in Odd Thomas, he's a short order cook, and so he goes in pages and pages about all these different terms. Stretch them, you know, 2 eggs, stretch them and wreck them, you know, or whatever it is, and what that means. And so there's some rich language and vocabulary that can exist within a character's occupation. You're going to say something about military, Pops?
Well, no, I was just, yeah, I was. I see what you're getting at. I mentioned military earlier. I thought you were referring to that. Yeah, occupation will definitely affect the way people talk, and you especially see this in the military, even for people who have not made a career out of the military, those who have maybe done 2 years, 4 years, something like that. When they come out, there are phrases that they will use, many of them, for the rest of their life without even thinking. So you've probably heard someone respond to you when you yes, and they say, "Roger that." And it's not something we say in normal speech, but you can pretty much guess that that they got that out of the military. So, and even especially enlisted coming out of boot camp. Micah is a friend of Aaron's and son of a friend of mine. And when he came out of the Marine boot camp, the way he referred to me, because I'm his senior, and the way he had been taught, he called me sir, still does. Or before he went in, he didn't do that. I won't tell you what he called me before he went in. But anyway, always with such respect. And he would do that with, and I've seen many do this, refer to those who are older than them as sir. And people in the South will do that, by the way, too. In the Deep South, you always refer to people older than you by a sir.
Or ma'am.
Or ma'am.
Please don't make me a sir.
Sir Lee? How about Sir Lee? And we might as well go ahead and bring this in, too.
You would be the first one to do that.
Let me bring this in while we're talking about that, then, is if you're going to have somebody from, say, like Russia, you have to learn some of their speech patterns, because in Russia, the younger person will always refer to an older person by their name and their patronym. So it'll be Ivan Ivanovich. You never just call him Ivan. It's always Ivan Ivanovich, where the older one might not do that to the younger person. He might just refer to him by his, what they would call a Christian name, Piotr or something like that. So when you're doing your dialogue, you have to do some research too.
Well said. Education is another thing to consider. The higher the education, typically the higher the vocabulary, the more expansive the vocabulary.
Indubitably.
Yeah, you like to show off. Our kids' teachers are always very impressed with my children's vocabulary. They've just got such a huge vocabulary. Where did they learn all these words? From us. My wife and I are both highly educated, and we choose not to talk down to our children. So we use all the words that we would use when we're speaking to adults. And so consequently, their vocabularies are a lot more expansive, and it's helped quite a bit in school. And they say very silly things. If you follow me on Facebook, you'll know. Very silly, funny things. Hobbies. You asked me to talk about Magic the Gathering. I will talk about Magic the Gathering. You will wish you never asked me about Magic the Gathering. And so, using language that comes from hobbies is another thing. But paying close attention to these is really going to lend some credibility to the characters in your fiction. But now let's just talk about dialogue itself. And so I want to mention some rules here. And we've got a few minutes, we started a couple minutes late, so I want to get through all of these, because this is where I think a lot of the meat of the podcast is. A couple rules. again in quotation marks here. First of all, characters do not sound alike and should not sound like the narrator unless it's first person. I've mentioned that already. And here's the first one. Here's how dialogue should suggest naturalness without actually being natural. You need to eliminate the routine exchanges of ordinary conversation. For example, how are you? I'm good, thank you. You? I'm fine. What have we learned from this? Absolutely nothing. We are now incredibly bored. The only way that this is any way remotely interesting is if a character is not good and yet they say that they are. And even then, you could probably get rid of these types of things. These fall into the category of ordinary exchanges of conversation. They don't give us much. And again, unless there's a dramatic irony at work here, this isn't doing much for us. It's empty words. It's stuff that can be cut off the page. Remember, and I'm going to say this probably 100 times this week, less is always more. The number one thing that you can do to improve your dialogue is to cut it out. One of the rules that I teach my children, my students, is this: if you cannot express the information in any other way than within quotation marks, go ahead and use quotation marks. Otherwise, don't use them. And the reason is because they always put lazy things in dialogue. They always, hello, how are you? Fine. And we don't want that. That's not adding anything. Cut it. Get rid of it. I can tell you right now, you could probably cut about anywhere from 35 to 65% of your dialogue and have a much stronger book. You need a lot less than you actually feel like you do. Another point here, dialogue should convey a sense of spontaneity, but eliminate the repetitiveness of real talk. For example, somebody says, do you like the Coke? And they respond, yes, I like it. It's good. Well, we've got 3 answers there. Like, we had 1 question and 3 answers. Why do we need 3 answers? Now, is a person actually going to say that IRL in real life, as the kids might say these days? Yes, they probably would. However, we don't need our characters to do that. This goes again to the category of suggesting naturalness without being natural. Okay? We often repeat ourselves in life, and we don't need to. Another example. Well, I was kind of, wondering if maybe like if you're not busy, maybe we could kind of go out together if you're not too busy. Now, what you're wanting to do here, pardon me as I cough, is demonstrate the nervousness of the character. And so you want, the temptation as a writer is to be repetitive, to show a character stumbling over their words. You want them to seem unsure of himself or herself. You want them to be nervous. But there's another way to get that information to the reader that doesn't have to be within the quotation marks. Okay? For example, he fidgeted, stared at his feet, worked hard not to stumble over his words, period. Quotation marks. If you're not busy later, maybe we could go out for coffee, question mark. Okay? So here, it's the exposition that's setting up the nervousness rather than the dialogue. And again, I think that's the place for it, because you can communicate the idea much more efficiently than you can in dialogue. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you had it in the show notes, that line of, well, I was kind of, that whole thing. And you're right, people do talk like that in real life, but looking at it in print almost gave me a headache. It was annoying. Okay, I get it. You're nervous and you're repetitive and you're stumbling all over yourself, but it really bothered me to read it like that.
It can get very annoying. Absolutely. We get the point. This, I think, is one of the marks of delineation, if you will, between a competent and confident writer and a new and experienced writer. The new and experienced writer wants to make their dialogue sound exactly like what comes out of people's mouths. They have not yet learned that you need to take what comes out of people's mouths and cut it by 50 to 75%. Once they learn that, then things get a lot tighter. You'll see it even if you watch any television show, really, most of the writers have very lean, sparse dialogue. You don't have people tripping over themselves and fumbling over words, and nobody stutters unless their character is specifically called to stutter, etc. Everybody, it's very smooth, and that's how we like our information. So we need to do that on the page as well. Pops, you also had some hints here to add.
Well, to the writing of dialogue, a few things. Because this is one of the things that will make a writer look very much the amateur if you don't get the dialogue down. It's a perfect reason for an editor to reject it because it needs to be compelling. So I would suggest this and how to learn to write dialogue. And one is to catch the rest of these podcasts that we're going to be doing because we're going to be giving some solid pointers, especially in the next one, about what not to do. The second is pick a few skilled authors and study the dialogue. And I want you to listen to that carefully. I want you to study the dialogue. I mean, analyze the dialogue. Take a look at it. And when you do that, this is the third thing, take note of punctuation. The one mistake I see in dialogue among new writers is they don't know what to do with the punctuation in relation to the quotation marks. And it's getting confusing because often what's done on the internet is not correct. So take a good look at it. The punctuation usage, the quotes, for example, and single quotes. In the United States, we use, and this is why Aaron's been doing the double quotes, the finger things. We start a bit of dialogue first with a double quote, and then if we have a quote within a quote, you use a single quote. It is the opposite. They start with a single quote, and quotes within quotes are double quotes. So when you are studying, make sure you're studying an American English author, right, for the British. If it's going to be published in Britain, they know that we write differently than they do. Just like when we read, an Agatha Christie or something, it will have the British choices as far as punctuation goes, and there are some differences in spelling. So study punctuation usage, which includes quotes and single quotes. Comma usage, where does a comma go? Almost always it goes inside the quotation mark. Seldom does it go outside. The two bits of punctuation that go outside a quotation mark are two-part punctuations, a semicolon and a colon. Few tough ones that you have to make a judgment call on that. There's some debate on it, but most of the time you don't have to worry about that. Punctuation goes inside except those two. Odd spellings and phraseology, learn to use some of those in your dialogue. For example, having someone say, "What you think," is more realistic than "What do you think?" depending on the character. So "What you think," I ain't gonna do it. He's been out racing, dropping the G. He's been out racing his motorbike. The character, just be consistent in those. Tags, which we're going to talk about in detail next time, but take note of what those writers are doing with that. And then also study how dialogue shows emotion. So look at how the quotes and the single quotes are used, comma usage, odd spellings. They're really customized spellings, dialogue tags, and how dialogue shows emotion. So just pick some quality writers, go through, again, American English writers, go through, take a look at it. And you can learn a lot about writing dialogue doing that and have more fun than any other way.
Agreed. And I'm going to throw out one other little tidbit here about improving your dialogue. Man, I was stalling for time. It was there. It was great. It was a great idea. And now it's gone. Oh, my goodness.
So we do a dance while it comes back?
Sure. Yeah, do a dance, please.
Well, listen, Aaron, as you get older, you'll find that it gets worse.
Yeah. Talking about
I'm going to be eternally young, so that never happens to me. I'm just saying.
Right.
Got it. Okay. So nobody speak. All right. One thing that you can do to really help to think of your dialogue helping your character, developing character. It's a little exercise. Write the worst thing they've ever said to somebody else. What's the worst thing they've ever said to somebody? And resist the temptation to say, the easy ones. like "you're really ugly" or "I wish you were dead" or whatever other ones come to mind in the first 3 or 4 seconds that you're thinking about this. Really think about it. What's the worst thing somebody has ever said to somebody else? And then if you can kind of key in on that, it can really help your characters develop. As a matter of fact, I've got a scene in Hand of Adonai, the first book, the Book of Things to Come, in which Lauren says something pretty despicable. And it was not going to go into the book. But once I finished writing that scene, I realized this has to go in the book because it immediately opened up her character to me. And it showed me exactly who she is. And it's, even though it's something that she says it's very mean-spirited, it's, she's not a terrible person. She's not a mean person. And so I learned a lot about my character that way. And so that's one of the things that I feel like you should do. What is the worst thing your character has ever said? And write that scene, whether or not it goes into your book. I think that will help you to kind of open your eyes as to who your character is. So I wanted to mention that before we were done. So
that makes me so sad. I don't want to know how bad my characters are. It makes me so sad because they're already telling me the worst things that they've said in my head in the last 2 minutes, and I don't want to know this about them.
It can be a challenge, but it really makes you know your character is a lot better. Do you know which scene I'm talking about, Molly Jo? Do you remember it?
I do, and I'm very glad that you kept that in there. I know we had talked before, you had talked about not putting that in there, but it really added not just to her character, but to the overall story. It was a good choice to keep that in.
And I think it's going to echo throughout the series. There have already been other places where she's said things that she's not been very proud of. And so dialogue, developing your characters is really a good way to go. And so, again, if you get nothing else out of this, I think the most important thing to get is cut your dialogue as much as humanly possible. Cut out every single word that you can do without, and you're going to have stronger dialogue than when you began. We're going to talk next week about dialogue killers. Before we start the sign-off process, though, Pops or Molly, is there... Oh, Molly, I've got to go to you. Do we have any questions from the room tonight?
We don't have any questions in the room. We did have a couple of it was in... Bleh. Let me start over. No, Aaron, we don't have any questions in the room, but we did have decent conversation. So thanks to Tess and Andy and Marie, who all joined into the chat room. It was good conversation. And I was texting over here, if you guys saw me on my phone, I was texting Alicia Morales. She's a very, very good friend of ours from Blue Ridge, and she and I have been in contact a lot lately. So she messaged me, and I said, can't talk now in the middle of the podcast. Her husband is driving, so she pulled it up on her phone, and she caught the last 15 minutes of the podcast on her iPhone. So way to go, sister. She says it was all really good, but we forgot to talk about talking heads. That kind of dialogue can get very confusing.
Well, next week, though, we're talking about dialogue killers, so.
There you go. So stay tuned, Alicia. Come back next week.
I would hope that whatever part of the body is talking, it would be the head. I don't know what other parts of the body might be talking, but I guess we could talk about that later. So we'll define maybe next week or the following week what a talking head is and why it's bad and why you should avoid that. So, but next week, dialogue killers. Don't forget to send in your Ask the Author questions. A couple ways to do that, either Facebook, Twitter, drop it on the YouTube if you want, or through aarongansky.com. You could always email me if you wanted, agansky@msn.com. I don't know if I should have just given out my email address. I'm like, well, I trust you guys. You're good people. You can send in the email address to that address, or the questions to that email address, and I'll get it. You can find us. You can find Pops at altongansky.com. You can find Molly Jo at frankly-my-dear-mojo.com. You can find me at aarongansky.com. So thank you all for listening. And until next week, good writing.